Welcome everyone to today's weekly web chat. I'm Darcy Bachigard, and joining me today are two North Dakota teachers to share their strategies for stimulating discussion in the classroom. So welcome Wendy, Josh, thanks for taking time out of your schedule to be here. Wendy, would you start? Just introduce yourself. Who are you, where do you teach, and what do you teach all day?
Sure, I am Wendy Beekler, and I am the 7th through 12 English teacher at Ashley Public School. I've been teaching this is my 3rd year here, and a fun fact, I am teaching in my old school, my old classroom, everything.
I absolutely adore that. And where are you at, Josh?
I'm in Washburn. I teach 7th through 11th grade English here, and this is my 5th year teaching in Washburn, teaching anywhere, but been all 5 years in Washburn. And
we are fortunately / unfortunately 3 English teachers. So I'm going to try as we're talking, and I'm sure, both of you talk to your colleagues. We'll try to share as many examples that are non-Englishy as possible, and I'll try to be that voice. We also are, again, fortunately or unfortunately, all high school 7 through 12 teachers. However, I firmly believe that the strategies that we're sharing today are across the board. These are things that you could do with students as low as kindergarten. So even some of the things that we're going to be talking about that are writing based, we can talk about modifications of how to make those non-sentence writing based. So for whatever grade or subject you think, as you teach, as we're sharing these strategies, do be thinking, how would you adapt this basic idea to your grade level, to your content area? Because these are just good teaching strategies, really, in order to get kids talking more in our classrooms. Because that's the goal, right? We want to hear what they have to say. So as always, we have a resource deck. Everything links throughout here. And we're going to start with a weird concept of silent discussions. This feels like the opposite of what we want, of getting more kids involved. But I got to see this in your classroom, Wendy, and everyone was so engaged. Can you just walk us through what is a silent discussion?
Okay, so a silent discussion is essentially questions, like anticipation questions that you might have that you would probably normally do as like a class and talk about before you read a story or do something like that. But I was having trouble in my classroom with it. No matter how hard you try to incorporate all the students, some of them just are silent. They will not give you an answer, and they just don't want to talk. There's anxiety to it and whatever. So I did some research to try to figure out a way to get everybody in, and I found this silent discussion, which is really, really cool. So I make a PowerPoint slide, and I post, whatever the prompt is going to be, and it usually has to do with like themes or something we're going to run into. So yeah, number 1 for my To Kill a Mockingbird is, if someone is on trial for murder, they're probably guilty. So the kids put their name at the top, they answer, yes, I agree with this statement, no, I don't agree with this statement, and then give reasons why. And I give them normally 1.5 to 2 minutes, which it doesn't seem like a long time, but they just kind of have to give one reason why they believe it, basically. And then once the time is up, they pass their paper to their neighbor, or I'll do fun things so it's not always the same and be like, find somebody who's wearing the same color as you are, or something along those lines. And then they either have the option to answer the new prompt, so the number 2, or they can talk and discuss to what the answer was before. So if somebody said, no, I don't agree with this statement, and then that person can be like, well, I don't agree with you, and then say it in a nice way and kind of give their reasons why. And I have also changed it so that they can answer, answer both the new prompt and reply to the other person.
Okay, so if they have time while they're writing, the goal is to have them write for that whole time.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Because you don't want them just to sit there and put like, no, I don't agree with this because I just don't agree with it. So before we do the silent discussions, I normally go through, I model a reply that would be worth credit and a reply that wouldn't be worth credit. Because when they're done, I go through and I circle all their initials and then I count it up and I read through the responses because that's the fun part of it. And I let the kids read through the responses too when they get their paper back because that's where the discussion happened. And every kid is engaged the entire time, which is wonderful and everything that I've ever wanted. And they have fun with it and they get to express their opinions, and that's what 7 through 12 kids like to do. Well, everybody likes to express their opinions for the most part. And this way I'm getting the silent kids to also talk, which is or whatever. Yeah, but it's been a wonderful activity and I've had 7 through 12 do it now. So,
and it's worked 7th through 12th grade for various topic matters.
Yes, yeah, which is why I think it could be applied to many other curriculums or different studies and the younger grades too.
This would easily be something that a social studies teacher could adapt.
Oh yeah.
Like that crossover seems really easy. And then any teacher who's teaching kids who can write at all, this is also just taking kids. I love that you give them an example of what counts as a response, like an actual argument and not. Mm-hmm. They are practicing in a very non-threatening way, argumentative writing.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So it's a really nice way. I could see at the elementary level or possibly even the high school level adapting this so it was an informative discussion. Mm-hmm. So rather than being an argumentative kind of style of writing, I think you could easily do this having prompts that could be either anticipatory, kind of like a silent KWL going around. I think that you could figure out a way to do that. And certainly you could shift this instead of an anticipatory set, use it throughout a unit or at the end of a unit as kind of a recap. Josh, you also have an anticipatory discussion idea, but it's not silent. It's the opposite of silent in terms of what you're going for. Can you tell us about this anticipatory discussion idea?
Sure. So this one here has a mix of this anticipatory set of questions that Wendy described, but then also using the philosophical chairs model for having a discussion within the class. And so again, having prompts almost verbatim to what the To Kill a Mockingbird ones were, or for whatever novel, or as you were talking about cross content classes, even having statements that have to do with history, like say World War II and things leading up to that, you know, I could see it there as well, but things that they have to agree or disagree on and come together and discuss. I always want them, when they are discussing with each other, to acknowledge the person who spoke directly before them and make sure that they say something, you know, I know you said this, but, you know, whether that's disagreeing or agreeing, but for other reasons, right? And seeing that there can be multiple points to even the same argument is something that that I am hoping to get out of that discussion between the students. The teacher is much more a devil's advocate, a person of clarification for some students who are, you know, maybe sometimes for the first time putting their thoughts out in words, and maybe it's not always the clearest for other students who are also trying to figure that out for themselves.
Right.
So to be there to kind of clarify and say, so you're saying, and trying to put it in words that maybe a more general audience can understand. And if I'm completely wrong, then that leads them to try and come up with another way of saying what they want to try to say. So that's kind of the first part of it.
Mhm.
And then after that discussion, as a homework assignment, I give them an evaluation form that they need to fill out. And that evaluation form requires them to just talk about how the discussion went. What worked well, what didn't work well, did they change their opinion, what conclusions can they draw about how they came up with their decisions, and what would they like to see different, because we do it at least a couple times throughout the year. And then we don't really do anything with that again until the very end of the book. And so we come back at the very end to do a post-reading reflection. And there they have to, I give them the list of statements that we had gone over at the beginning, and I ask them to pick one of them, and I want them to see if after reading the assigned reading, have they changed their opinion, or has their position been reinforced by the reading? And whichever way they go with that statement, I want them to explain it, providing examples from the text as to what exactly helped them change or reinforce their position.
Back to the beginning part, one thing I really like that both of you are doing is you're modeling that good discussion. I think all too frequently, at least in my classroom, a lot of students, one student says something and everyone just silently agrees and is like, yeah, like they covered it. And they don't know. I honestly don't think that students always know that you can, what you just said, Josh, that you can build onto someone's argument. You can agree with them, say yes, and extend that argument. So I love that you're both really helping students dig deeper into their thinking and express it more fully. How about you, Wendy? Like Josh shared this anticipatory discussion, post-reading reflection. Do your groups ever go back to that anticipatory set and reflect on that, compare that to their experience in the novel? Does it come up during the reading at all?
Yeah, I kind of keep like that and the questions that I've asked like with my novel, and as we get to them, or if it gets kind of towards the end of the novel, we talk about it. I'm like, okay, do you guys remember the question, like people often fear what they don't understand? And when we get kind of to like that court part of To Kill a Mockingbird, that's kind of where we talk about that. And a few of those kind of hit the court scene. We spent quite a few days talking about the court scene. So,
of course.
But yeah, we kind of do a lot while we're reading. We'll kind of bring up that statement again and be like, do you kind of remember what you said? Because they have to keep their papers and they kind of go back and be like, okay, I can see where maybe my idea has changed, or no, I still stand with that. Or they're like, I'm not really sure what to think yet. And I'm like, well, wait till we finish the book. So we do go back to it more so just through discussion. It's not anything like a formal assignment or anything like that.
Sure.
But then towards the end, all of my final projects tie into kind of picking one of these and doing kind of an analysis with it. But it's not that we're like going back through and doing all of the questions again.
And that's similar. Is that what you found too, Josh, that it's easier for students to focus on one statement rather than going back and trying to have them summarize every single idea?
Well, I think one of the big reasons why I decided to go that way is because there might have been just one that really grabbed their attention at the beginning, or one that they really gravitated towards through reading the book. And so I didn't want necessarily to just get something that was an inch deep and a mile long. I wanted something that they could just focus on more in depth.
That's a great way of saying it. Where do you go to find your anticipatory guides?
So I Google different questions, like to ask for all of them, but I don't know. I have to pick ones that I know are going to fit in with my kids, because my rural school is going to be way different than a school in New York who, you know, like, I mean, you can just pull things from everywhere. So I kind of pick and choose what I want to do. And then I have some resources just that are in the books and whatnot. So I don't really come up with all of my own things. I steal a lot of people's stuff and make it my own.
I don't think it's stealing. I think it's like working smarter, not harder, right?
Yeah.
Like these themes are universal, and the themes of To Kill a Mockingbird have been the themes of To Kill a Mockingbird for 40, 50 years. So probably they're the same kind of themes, because I do the same thing. I look, and then I really like your point though. You modify those based on your school and your kids.
Yes. Yeah, I rarely find a document that's going to completely work for my class. I always have to do something to fix it. But I think that's better. Like, I then am working through it. I'm not just taking something and handing it to them and being like, I've never done this before. I'm actually working with it, knowing what's going on. The fact that I have to write out all of my prompts, I then know what they are, and I have to think about them and get my own opinions. So.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add as far as where I go out and find these. One thing I did want to add though is I'm sure Wendy finds this too, but one of the great things is when you don't bring up one of the anticipatory statements, but a student does, like after they had some sort of reading assignment and they come in and they're like, oh, this totally connects to what we were talking about, and they have that kind of aha moment is fun.
I love those moments because it's, at least in my classroom, they always seem surprised. As if I haven't been planning this whole thing. They always seem genuinely like, oh my goodness, do you realize, Miss B, that like, and I'm like, oh man, really? Yeah. We do actually structure this as teachers, but I don't think that's part of teaching, right? Yeah. People in general don't realize how much planning, even the simplest tasks, how much thought we are putting into the front end of our classrooms. How do you lay the groundwork for discussions in your classroom in general? Like, how do you create the system, so to speak, for lack of a better word, for fostering communication in your classroom?
Well, I think one thing that being in a small school setting allows for is we have these kids for multiple years. And so given a year or two in, you know kind of who is with whom. And so, you know, sometimes I will gravitate more towards whole group discussions with one class, and sometimes I'll gravitate more toward smaller groups, think pair shares with other classes, because I know that if that group tries to do a whole class thing, it's just going to turn into chaos. And so you got to kind of go with what the students allow you to do.
I agree with him. I think it also has a little bit to do with like your classroom environment. And like, since we have the kids 7 through 12, you get to build that relationship with the students that I think makes them comfortable enough to be able to express their opinions in class. And I think that's one of the biggest things too, is that kids have to feel comfortable to express their opinions without being like ridiculed by the teacher or others. And I think that it has to be modeled, because I spent a few days, like anytime we do our first discussion activity as a class, but like my 9th through 12th graders by now know what my specifics are of what a good discussion is and how to be appropriate doing it. The 7th, 8th, and 9th sometimes need a little tweaking here and there. But I think you have to definitely model and set expectations for what should be said, how to be respectful of others' opinions, and how to handle when you have conflicting opinions.
Those are great. Do you have actual rules or expectations that you lay out either in the classroom or in the syllabus, or do the students come to those agreements as you're going through the class? Do you have any tips for people of how to help establish that?
I think that I don't have them posted anywhere, which I kind of want to, especially because we do Socratic seminar. And that's like the first discussion that the kids get to learn about in my classroom. And that I set like specific expectations to get a like handout with what's expected for them to do. And so those are just kind of applied for all discussions.
Okay.
But I think that going over kind of rules, expectations, whether it's a handout or just verbally too, and making sure to like nip problems in the butt right away will definitely help with discussions and making sure that it moves forward well. So
I think one thing that I do with one particular class is I have them, there's a kind of a group project that they have to do at one point in the year, and they have to we go over establishing roles within the groups, what each person needs to do throughout the project, and then they come up with their own sort of rules and guidelines, and I give them some examples for that. I think that's really the only thing I can think of for like formal rules. And then also we do Socratic seminars as well, where I lay down what those look like to everybody with a handout. But as far as general kind of classroom climate discussions and general discussions, nothing formal, but I think what Wendy said was important. Nipping things in the bud right away sets those expectations pretty well.
You've both really done a great job of articulating that it's all about knowing your kids and what's going to work for that particular group. For me, I also don't have anything posted on my walls ever. I haven't done that. I sometimes have reminders of like the different layers, the different levels of questions. At West Fargo, we used Costa's questions, but certainly having like sentence stems from Bloom's taxonomy can help kids of what's a level 1 question, an easy kind of remembering question, and what is pushing you up Bloom's taxonomy. I do, and I'll throw this up here so quickly. The only other thing that I do, and I wonder if neither of you have talked about this, but I do require my seniors to lead a discussion. So after we've read some things together, and I have modeled, and we've worked out the kinks of doing a discussion together, toward the end of the first semester, or sometimes just in second semester, just depending on the kids and what's going on, they have to lead a discussion, but they do it in teams, so 4 or 5 people lead the discussion, and they have to come up with a starting activity. They have to have the different levels of Costa's questions. And then their job is I join the conversation as a participant. Like I literally just sit in a discussion circle with the kids, which I do even when I'm leading the discussion. But then these 4 or 5 kids, they're asking the questions and they're asking the follow-up questions. And so it's taking those conversation skills and trying to develop that next level up of not only can you engage in a conversation, but can you be one of the people who's helping get the conversation going without just resorting to lecturing. Is that anything, have you done any types of activities like that, or even other types of activities that are shifting that onus onto the kids of them leading the discussion, coming up with the discussion? How do you help ensure that their voice continues to be heard throughout those class discussions?
For Socratic, the first one, like the first discussion that we have, I will normally like be the leader, but then after that I step back and somebody has to just become the leader. I definitely don't have like, that's a cool project though, that they have to like create their own and have the questions and all that. So I don't formally do that, but anytime I have like small group discussions. So for example, my seniors, because they're a larger class and we're going into poetry right now, so it hasn't really been working to have like whole class activities with these poems. Like I don't know, it just hasn't been working very well. So I decided to break them into small groups, and then they are now established a leader that needs to guide the discussion. And they have like, I have a poetry packet that gives them questions to ask themselves. And so that's kind of the newest thing I'm trying to do, is establishing a bigger leader, because they have roles, you know, when I do.
Kind of like what Josh was talking about for group norms. So
yes.
You're talking about literature still, they're working on a project, but some of the same small group kind of focus. And I've certainly done lit circles where the kids are reading different books at the same time in the classroom. And so that's great. What do you have, like, what kind of roles do the kids have to take on?
So I always have a reader so that they don't fight over who has to read the poem, you know. So I have a reader, and then I have the facilitator who's the leader. Like, they have to make sure that everybody's talking. They have the question stems or whatever they're kind of pointing out and that type of thing. And then I have a writer, because they have a worksheet that they need to be filling out to the poems, and kind of what was said, what was discussed, you know, more so just the recorder thing. So today was really well with it, but I had planned that they'd get through like 3 poems, and they barely got through 1. But I mean, they were talking and discussing, so it's not like they were off task. They just were actually having a good time. So I was really happy with it.
Well, that's good. That's kind of what Josh said, though, of let's take things deeper rather than a list a mile long. Let's actually dive in. For you, Josh, like, what other just general activities do you like to use to stimulate discussion, but make sure that you're hearing what your students want to talk about?
One thing you mentioned I also do is literature circles. My juniors, half the class reads one novel, half the class reads another one. They get to pick which one they read. And then sometimes we have some cross discussions, because there are some thematic mirroring between the two, even though they're completely opposite books. One group is reading 1984, the other group is reading The Scarlet Letter, but you'd be surprised even in those two how there are societal similarities.
Yeah.
And so each of those circles that are reading those, they have to engage in their own discussions, and then I'll kind of bounce back and forth and listen to them when they're doing that on those particular days.
That reminds me of something when we were looking at that anticipatory set of questions for To Kill a Mockingbird, this silent conversation. I could see making a large poster board sheet with that theme and hanging it up around the room. In my class, I could see really enjoying that, because I have, 3 sections of seniors who might be reading the same book. And if I did do posters for each of these questions, if we did the silent conversation, or even the Socratic, the philosophical chairs rather, that Josh was describing, we could take little snippets and, paste them, like literally tape them up onto the different conversations. And then I could see doing this, kind of connects to some of these resources back here of doing kind of like a chat station activity. If you had those posters up with each of these statements on it, and you added some of their anticipatory set ideas, throughout the novel, sporadically, one like bell ringer, like 10-minute starting activity could be to have the kids walk back around through those prompts and add quotes from the book that connect to one of those prompts, or to add a reflection, or like to summarize something from the plot and start adding page numbers which would give you like this ongoing living conversation, but it would also give the kids, when it did come time to do a project or write a paper or do that reflection, they would have all of these things to interact with. I was just thinking about that as both of you were talking, that it could become like a gallery walk kind of conversation going on around the room.
So for The Great Gatsby, I do something similar to the gallery walk with the colors. We really focus on the color symbolism. Mm-hmm. And so they all have like all the different colors around my room on like big poster board. And then they are keeping track of it in their books and then, or in their notebooks, sorry. And then they will go write like the page number and usually like some key words, like what was associated with it on those poster boards. And then at the end of, not normally every chapter, but a few chapters, we'll pause. It depends on the class size again. If it's, you know, my like 4 kids or whatever, it doesn't pay to go around. It's just kind of a all class discussion. Okay. But when I have a bigger class, I send them in pairs to each different color station, and they kind of talk about, well, where do they think like blue is leaning towards? What is it symbolizing? Right. Where is it relevant? So I have done that. But it would be cool to keep the themes up in the room and have they have to give textual evidence of where is this happening in the book and like what's happening to show those themes. So that's the idea.
One thing that I was thinking of to even modify that for classes that, or teachers who have multiple classes, if somehow you could schedule it to where you have 3 or 4 classes that are reading a novel, if you can find anything that overlaps, and then have those walk-arounds, but even have the students distinguish, this is an example from this book, and then you could see other examples from other books that deal with the same types of themes.
That would be awesome for those lit circles, like what you were just talking about. That's a great idea, Josh. I did this silent chat station. I did this with my AP juniors, and honestly, this is going to sound so rude, but I was to the point where I was so sick of a couple students just dominating the conversation. And I had tried a whole bunch of different tactics. I had even had conversations with those kids. Because in the past, so be thinking if you have any strategies for me, because one thing I tried with one group of seniors I had once, when they came into class, I had a bowl of Tootsie Rolls and a bowl of Starbursts at the front of the room. And I said, you can take 2 to 5 pieces of candy and then sit down. So they could just take a few. And then I explained that however many pieces they had taken was how many comments they were required to contribute to today's conversation. And they could only eat the piece of candy once they had shared something in the conversation. And I specifically got very chewy candy, I explained, because while you're chewing it, you can't talk. You have to just be quiet and chew and listen to your classmates. But I tried this other technique where I literally hung up, you were talking about Gatsby, I hung up questions around the room, and I just did these on regular pieces of paper. And so a station might have something like this, Nick says, and they just had to identify a key quote. But as they rotated around, if someone had already filled out part A, someone else had to complete the part B for that quote. So Nick says, and they put a literal quote, and then the next person at that station has to explain what that quote shows about the scene or about Nick, kind of thing. And we did this, I hung up, I had a poster for as many kids, like topics for as many kids were in my class. And then they had their books with them and a pen, and they had 2 minutes at each station, very similar to Wendy's silent discussions. They had 2 minutes at that station, and then they rotated. And we did that for the first about 20 minutes of class. And I did like that in part because I hung them up around the room. They got to move around. This activity stemmed out of me being kind of frustrated with discussions, but ended up being really fun. When you have those kids who are dominating, or those kids who are just, for whatever reason, not participating, what have been some of your strategies to help balance the voices in your classroom?
So for Socratic, depending upon the class, if it was a class that I didn't really have issues with everybody talking, but I know my first year that I was teaching, I had trouble with a few students in one of the classes that just wouldn't talk. Like they were fine taking a 0, not talking. I'm like, okay. Well, I decided that they couldn't just do that anymore, and I pulled them aside and talked to them and said, you have to start contributing. And maybe they just thought that I wasn't noticing that they weren't talking. I don't know. So I gave them playing cards. I gave everybody like 3 cards, I think is what I ended up doing. And if you wanted to talk, because I also had issues with the dominant ones wanting to talk over each other constantly, like they wouldn't let other people talk. So what I did was they had to lay down their card, and whatever order the cards were in is the order they got to talk in, basically.
Ooh, I like both layers of that.
Yeah. So that way if they had 3 cards left, it was a 0 that day. If they had 2 cards left, it was whatever points, that type of thing. And for some reason, the cards worked for the kids that weren't talking. I don't know. I don't know what they thought they were getting away with, but it worked.
Well, and sometimes it's just a matter of reminding them what, Josh, you were saying at the beginning, that you can be nodding your head and agreeing with someone. And if you agree with them, yeah, play a card and explain why. Like that is good contribution to the discussion. Say yes and explain something else. So, but that's a great visual of cards. And I like that order. Like if multiple people want to talk. For you, Josh, anything like that or different? Like how do you balance the voices in these classes?
It's tough. It's difficult to do, and I think one thing that has helped was having them do that evaluation. Kind of sets them up with an expectation of, geez, I need to contribute so that I have something to fill out on this form, or else I'm not going to have anything to fill out. And I that's one way that has helped. But again, there are some students that you said are like, I'm perfectly fine with taking a 0. So so that one becomes more of a struggle. And I really like that that card idea. I have not cracked the mystery of getting everybody engaged yet. So
how do you tackle grading discussions? Because I've done everything from nothing to tallying to the student's reflection kind of thing. What are some of your strategies for grading a discussion?
Reflection is one. Tally is another that I've used before, especially in if we're doing like a Socratic seminar, making sure that everybody has put in their input for that. Another way too is just maybe not grading everybody during the same discussion, but if I know that, let's say, I'm going to be walking around the room, and based on, okay, this discussion that I'm listening for 30 seconds or so, I like where it's going, so I'm going to give them, some points for their discussion. If I'm not hearing what I want, then I'll maybe tell them, steer them in the right direction, and then walk around again, and then a little bit later in class see if they've improved. If they haven't, then score them accordingly.
That's a great reminder. We do need to keep modeling and telling them what our expectations are. They don't know how to do this. Even as juniors and seniors, they still don't always know how to do this. So the more we can guide from the side and help steer them, that's a good reminder. How do you approach grading, Wendy?
It depends on what we're doing. The silent discussion, since they are modeling and that I'm modeling, and since it's only like a sentence to 3, if they even get that in really, that's kind of where you get points just based on, do you have good solid reasoning, or did you just write, no, I don't agree because I don't agree. The Socratic seminars is mostly like, did you contribute? And it's mostly like the preparedness of coming to this discussion. For me, I focus more so on that. And then plus like the discussion part, but it's just talking about the novel. I think that sometimes, or whatever we're doing, sometimes we might just have a discussion on grammar. We had that today with my kids, surprisingly.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. And then for the discussions with like what I'm doing with the seniors right now, that again is more so just what they're handing in and that they're getting those answers. It's not so much about the discussion. That's just part of it. That's
Thinking
part of their learning.
through the discussion.
So I think it depends if you want to be grading the discussion because that's what you're working on with your students, or if you're having a discussion to lead to something else. Is for me what I decide, is the discussion going to be graded, or is it important to what we're doing, or is it just helping them get to the final goal of, you know, analyzing the poems and that type of thing.
Excellent clarification. So what is the purpose of the discussion? Is the purpose of the discussion to practice discussion skills, and therefore their discussion skills really should be graded? Mm-hmm. Or is the purpose of the discussion something else, moving the conversation, like moving the ideas and going to this next phase in the project or the ideas? That's a great clarification. I've done simple things like every student gets a Post-it note as they come into the door, and there's a question on the board, right? And then that's one of the things that we do to start the conversation. Or everyone gets a Post-it note and they have to ask a question. And so I'm guaranteeing that everyone is participating a little bit. And I do other things like we draw scenes, like, right, I make them do frozen scenes. Like we'll start a discussion by saying, all right, getting teams of 5, and each of you has to come up with a key moment from the novel, and you do a frozen pose. And so I also try to throw in some like little activities that force everyone to start the conversation by engaging, because they don't have a choice. They have to draw a picture. They have to participate in a little skit or a little frozen activity. Do you have other little things that you layer into the conversations in addition? Or do you have any discussion formats? We've talked about the whole group discussion. If you go through this slide deck, there's a lot of different ideas of doing like the chat stations, of doing some of these gallery walks, philosophical chairs, pinwheel discussions. You've both talked about Socratic seminar, fishbowl, hot seat. Have you tackled any of these other discussion strategies, or is there something else that you just love to get kids fired up?
The think, pair, share, I kind of like a variation of that, especially with grammar, because grammar can get so boring and everything with the kids.
Really? No.
Yeah. And so I will sometimes, if I tell them, okay, like for sentence structures right now with my 7th graders, I say, okay, write the 4 sentence structures, and then get up, find a partner, show it to each other, kind of like grade, talk about like if somebody did it wrong, how can they fix it, and then go find another partner. And so those discussions are kind of going on with 7th graders. Sometimes it gets a little bit crazy, but they still are discussing and doing things. So I think just small things like that can sometimes help. And plus it takes away some of the pressure of me constantly going around asking questions. You know, they have each other. So I've done the think, pair, share. I have done snowball discussion. That one's been pretty fun.
Okay.
And gallery walks, that's my new thing. I really like those. Those are interesting and like really cool ways. I mean, there's so many ways to do them. Like that is something that can happen in every single class.
Well, and kind of what you just described of if they're writing 4 sentences and they get up and meet up, it's kind of a think, pair, share, gallery walk hybrid.
Yeah.
Where they're kind of doing a gallery walk of their sentences and then they switch and find someone else. And they're kind of, but they're also think, pair, and sharing of going through their things. So you're right. So many of these things are so flexible and adaptable to all kinds of different stuff. How about you, John? Anything from this list or just things that aren't on this list that you like to do to just mix it up or kick off the class, get the energy going, however you look at it?
One thing that I like to do with students is use sentence starters, and that is either giving them a whole list or sometimes even just giving them one strip that says, I don't understand, or I noticed, or I wonder, or I think, or anything like that, and then they have to fill it in and then use those to start our discussion the next day.
That's easy enough to do on Post-it notes or on little scraps of paper. I do want to throw out in our last 5 minutes, there are some tech tools. I do not use technology for all of my discussions. That just goes to me against the point of some discussions. But I have used things, and I've even created for one group of AP students, because it's what they preferred, we created a closed Facebook group, and we would do some asynchronous conversations in the closed Facebook group as part of, and then some of their thinking and musing, we would then use that in class itself. But all of these, I listed just off the top of my head quickly, these are the things that I have used in class as part of class discussions, either to make things that aren't necessarily like if I am doing kind of a lecture explaining a grammar concept, which I don't know why it's boring in your classroom. It's like flying to the moon in mine. It's so exciting. But I might use something like Pear Deck so that even a presentation becomes more interactive and has some discussion in it. Padlet is exactly like Post-its, it's just virtual. And so there's a little bit more anonymity to it, but you can just slap up discussion questions, kids could respond to each other. Are there any little tech tools that the two of you have used just to continue? To me, the goal is, as we've already said, hearing our students. Are there any little tech tools that you've brought in to help give voice to those quieter kids and help make sure that you are hearing everyone?
I can't say I have a tech tool, but I just thought of this. This is kind of a bigger thing for tech though, and discussions would be to like do a podcast.
Yeah.
For like the kids to like have to create their own podcast and like have questions, like they could have a guest or something. I don't know if you're pretending to, you could be pretend to be characters from a story, or I don't know, but I just thought of that's kind of like a tech thing to do, or even on
you could use Flipgrid. You could use Flipgrid to do that. That's what we've done, because there's apps. So for every 2 kids, even if I didn't have devices, if a couple kids have cell phones, they can have the app on their phone, and then you can set the limit on Flipgrid to be 15 seconds up to 5 minutes. So for short things, I would just keep it short, like, right? Yeah. All right, interview, you're Romeo, you're Juliet. What do you want to know about, like, interview each other?
Yeah.
Right? Or I would give them something, and then this would be our bell ringer. And then we would watch the videos as like different, like every time we needed a new discussion question, we would watch a video of one of those characters, and then we would talk about what the character told us, kind of thing. But yeah. I like that podcast idea. You could take that basic starter from class of Flipgrid and really take it much deeper in kind of an ongoing podcast thing. But the nice thing about Flipgrid too, you could create a whole page just for that book. And so kids could continue to post to it. So it would become kind of a podcast.
Yeah.
And a lovely librarian, Andrea, just told me like 2 weeks ago, you can now make a Flipgrid mixed tape.
Oh.
Yes, I haven't tried it yet.
Yeah.
You can take the different Flipgrid responses and put them together into a mixtape.
Well, that's cool.
So that could be an interesting ongoing discussion. And then students could have to create like a mixtape that captures some specific theme or something, mixing together the ideas from their class. And again, as someone who teaches multiple sections of the same thing, I really like the idea that I could have one Flipgrid for my English 11. And as we're talking about the things they carry, if we had those Flipgrid posts, all of my sections could see those posts and learn from each other.
Well, one online management resource that I use quite a bit is Schoology. And so in Schoology, you can actually set up discussions for kids in that particular course or class. And so I have done that a few times where we have discussions, comment threads about various topics that we're talking about in class. And so that has been, again, front-loading expectations of, you know, you can't just have like one-word responses. Your responses need to be you know, appropriate and all that sort of stuff. And so laying that down beforehand does give us some good responses that, going back to your other point, that allow those that don't particularly care for speaking up in front of the class can do so in the comments.
And do you have a school, like does your whole school use Schoology, or do you have your own Schoology account?
I have my own account. There's a couple teachers in our school that use it, but it's not a school-wide thing.
So that's great to hear that you're using the free version. There's all kinds of content management things like Haiku or Blackboard, Moodle. So if your school has something like that, and Wendy, you were just mentioning Google Classroom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not so much, they'll kind of have the discussions, but we're working on persuasion right now and looking at both sides of the argument. So I'm assigning an article because the NFL is kind of a big thing, and like, should we be supporting it? So they're going to read some articles on both sides of that argument, and then they have to post a discussion to that, just kind of answers, but it wasn't going to be a discussion because we were just going to do an in-class discussion.
Sure. So whatever your school has, that's a great, I hadn't even, of my whole list, Josh, I hadn't even thought of like those content management system type things. So yeah, Google Classroom, using your Schoology or whatever kind of Blackboard, Moodle account that you have. You could certainly have just a Google Doc or a Microsoft Office doc that you post a question to and just ask kids, you know, to reply to. This wouldn't have to be super complicated. But just a general reminder that sometimes what Josh just said, sometimes kids don't want to like actually speak out loud, but that doesn't mean they don't have something to say. So if the goal is to hear our students' ideas and opinions, sometimes a piece of paper, like a silent discussion or a piece of paper or something like that, or a tech tool can help them express their ideas without feeling quite so on the spot. Thank you both so much for sharing the resources that you've created, and even more, just sharing your time of being here after school in your busy schedules and sharing all of these ideas for making class discussion better.
Well, thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you so much.